So, welcome everybody. It's so glad to see a nice group of people here to talk about how we move forward on classroom assessment strategies for next generation science standards, Earth and Space Sciences. We know that instruction itself, getting used to 3D teaching and moving whole districts and schools and states forward on that agenda, has its own complexities, and then of course we also need to learn a new way or a more integrated way of assessing that kind of learning. And so today we have another in our webinar series about next generation science standards, Earth and Space Science. I'd like to thank my co-organizers for these web series, Aida Awad. This is Susan Sullivan. I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder. And my co-organizers on this webinar series are Aida Awad, Ed Robeck, John McDarris, and the working group for NGSS-ESS. And today we have two presenters, two panelists, two experts in assessment who are going to be providing some ways to approach this task. I'm joined today by Bill Penuel. Bill is a faculty member and professor in educational psychology and learning sciences here at the School of Ed at University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm also glad to be joined by Kathy Comfort. Kathy is the PI and director for PASS, which is the Partnership for the Assessment of Standards-Based Science at WestEd. And so I think they've done a great job of giving us some doable ways forward on thinking about this task. I'm also going to let you know about some future events that are coming up, and when we're done with presentation, we'll have a discussion which will take place in the chat or Q&A. So if you have questions as we're going along, please type those into the chat. You may be asking for resources. You may be confused about something. Anything that you think you'd like some input on, please type it into the chat, any comment or reflection. And if you're on the phone and you feel that you have an answer to some of those questions, you can feel free to add the resources. We know that there are lots of experts here, and so we just want to have a chance to have everybody express that expertise. So as I'm listening to people talk about assessment, here are some things that keep coming up, and I think that our presenters are going to share things that have relevance to these questions directly or indirectly. But first of all, why is NGSS 3D assessment important? So that's a question. People wonder, how are some good ways to get started? How do you even approach this task? And then anytime you're getting started on something new, there's always the question about what should I watch out for. So are there pitfalls, or are there common, rookie mistakes or something that people might fall into? So just some things to share, the sorts of things I hear, and some things to maybe be in the presenters' minds as they're going through. So I didn't want to leave this until the end. But I will put it up at the end so that you can take notes. We have webinars going forward from March through May, and topics are being defined for the next two. But webinars are taking place on the second Thursday of the month. They're taking place at this same time, so 2 p.m. Mountain Time where I am, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. There's one on March 10th, April 14th, and then on May 12th, we do have committed Ed Geary, who will be describing how to build a state coalition for NGSS, and he's speaking from his perspective in Washington State. Then I also want to point out that the Earth Educators Rendezvous is coming up in July. The dates for that are July 18th through 22nd, 18th through 22nd. And importantly, the abstract deadline for the contributed program is on March 1st. So we're hoping to have people who have NGSS work to share contribute to that program so that we can get a good body of people who would like to have a discussion and meet each other, maybe figure out how to collaborate with each other at the Earth Educators Rendezvous. So if you're working in this area, please consider submitting an abstract to that. I'll put the link for the workshop registration in the chat when in a couple minutes. Also, we will be having a workshop about NGSS at the rendezvous, and that will be led by Aida Awad. And for those who need travel support, there's also a travel stipend request form that's up. The deadline for that is April 1st. So hope to see you there and perhaps some of your colleagues. Yes, thanks, Ann. The rendezvous is in Madison, Wisconsin. And then there's also an email list, and that is for these kinds of events and this kind of discussion. So if you are not already on that email list, we invite you to sign up, and that will keep you apprised of events like this going forward. And I'll put that back up at the end of the webinar so that you have it. So with that, I want to turn it over to Bill, and after Bill, we'll go straight to Kathy, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards.
Great, thank you, Susan. So my name is Bill Penuel, and I'm on faculty, as Susan said, at the University of Colorado Boulder. And my research area is classroom assessment in science, and I've done most of my work in earth science. And I think relevant to the work I'm going to share today is I work very closely with teachers in Denver public schools for a number of years now on developing assessments in a collaborative fashion with teachers and district leaders. So my remarks today are oriented towards district and state leaders who are charged with the difficult task of designing three-dimensional science learning tasks, specifically here in earth science. And so I will present both examples of what three-dimensional assessment tasks look like, as well as some design tools that I hope that you will find useful. And I can say have been used already to guide work both in Denver and in Seattle public schools towards developing three-dimensional assessments. So another part of my biography is that I was on the committee that developed this particular report for the National Research Council on developing assessments for the next generation science standards. And if you haven't checked this out online or purchased a copy, I really highly recommend the book. The report is really sets a different pathway from Common Core and makes, I think, a number of sensible recommendations for how to implement a three-dimensional assessment system. Most relevant to this particular call is that we make in there a very strong argument for why it's really important to begin NGSS assessment with the classroom. The classroom is a place where there's the richest evidence available of what students know and can do. And it's by beginning with classroom assessments that we get I think that we can begin to understand the full range of proficiency that we hope students will develop that integrates the three dimensions of disciplinary core ideas, science and engineering practices, and cross-cutting concepts. And though I'm not going to really go into NGSS here and those three dimensions, but rather directly into this, I really recommend the Framework for K-12 Science Education as a place to go to really deepen one's understanding in ways that can organize the design of three-dimensional assessment tasks. And I'll say how we do that too here. A major recommendation of the report is that we're going to need different kinds of tasks. We call them in the report multi-component tasks. And by that, we mean tasks that are linked to one another, usually by a common scenario, or that might present a science phenomenon or a design challenge to students, and then ask a series of separate questions. And we make the argument there that to adequately cover the 3 dimensions of proficiency, there are going to need to be multiple components. Some of the components or individual questions might focus on practices, a core idea, even a piece of a core idea or cross-cutting concepts. But together, we need the components to work together to support our making inferences about students' 3-dimensional science learning as described in a given performance expectation. And I use this language of supporting inferences because the conception of assessment that we share in the report and that I hold, which is assessment is a process of argument from evidence. It's not a score. It is not a proficiency level, but rather an argument that is supported by evidence from what students say, do, have written, and we have to develop that through multiple sources. And the classroom is really a great way to see that, and I think most teachers would agree that their inferences about what students know and can do really come from a wide variety of sources, not just a single score. And they may even be disappointed by the kinds of profiles and scores that we get back. But we're trying to make an inference about this 3-dimensional science learning, the performance expectation, to use NGSS language. So what does something like that look like? This is an example that appears in the report, and it's an example that came from a study of a curriculum evaluation that we did of project-based inquiry science in their earth science, and it illustrates an example in which students are actually constructing and using models as their primary practice in this context. If you think about what you might find on the web, you're likely to find factual questions that ask, like what kind of plate what kind of plates are coming together here? What do we label this? And really, that's what I would call a less than one-dimensional item. And that actually all it's doing is measuring recall. Students are not even having to get the big idea here, which is that there are Earth dynamics from deep beneath the Earth that really shape the Earth's surface and the surface beneath the ocean floor and what those look like. And so what we're trying to get at is mechanism. That's the big idea here, not naming the plates and what's happening at the plates, but being able to explain what's causing the pattern that we see here of oceanic plates moving apart. On here, I call attention to these 4 parts, which each get at different dimensions or they're different components of the task. Students have to draw something on this picture to show what's happening in the mantle that causes the plates to move apart. So they're having to represent in visual form what that mechanism is. Then they're having to describe in words what's happening in the mantle that helps explain. So we're getting at the practice of explanation here. Then we're using the model. They have to actually use the model to make a prediction about where they're going to find the oldest rock in the crust, namely farthest away from where these 2 plates are moving apart from one another. And they have to explain why that is the case. This is a big shift from the multiple choice item that you can find usually that's on this particular topic. And what's going here, what really is activated here are a couple of different practices, both explanation and modeling, and a disciplinary core idea related to in earth science education and a framework focused on the dynamics that are happening inside the earth that explain the patterns that we see on Earth's surface and ocean floors. So that's an example of something that we might expect to see on a more summative test that you could give in your classroom and that would require students to construct an understanding, not just select from items that demonstrate their ability to apply an understanding of a disciplinary core idea in the context of engaging in a practice. Second example is one that illustrates the fact that tasks aren't just written. Some of the ways that we can get at 3-dimensionality occur over the course of a combination of questions that might happen, that a teacher might pose, and also the discussion that follows, as well as evidence that they might get from student responses to questions. Susan's asking an example one. Both of these are middle school examples that I give, so they're both for 6th grade. And they're aligned to the NGSS, relatively well to the NGSS. I would say the previous item is sort of in between the middle and the high school standards as NGSS is written, though this is aligned to the curriculum that we developed. In this case, the movement of water example is another example that appears in the NGSS and assessment report in the chapter on classroom assessment examples. And this also was developed collaboratively with Denver School Systems teachers to fit within the investigating or systems curriculum that was developed by AGI. And one of the things that we do here with formative assessment is that we actually built our understanding around a formative assessment cycle, which we called a pedagogical pattern. And the pedagogical pattern was part of our design work, and I think this is integral to understanding what makes an assessment formative is actually that you interpret and use results to adjust instruction. And so what happens in this particular pedagogical pattern that's associated with this item is that a teacher would pose a question of all students in the class. Students would discuss in pairs and small groups, and they answer first they would answer using a clicker software. And so all of them would answer the question, and it's a multiple choice question. And then they discuss their answers in pairs and small groups. And then the teachers ask in a whole class discussion why each response might be reasonable. And I want to highlight this particular aspect of our prompt, why each response might be reasonable. A key aspect of formative assessment that the research supports is to not focus on misconceptions and incorrect versus incorrect answers, but to really actually position students' answers as plausible and to actually try to understand why they reason the way they do and to understand different facets of student thinking. And so that's why we position this, is try to actually get to help the teacher ask the question to better understand where the student is coming from. And then we give teacher a set of talk moves, say more about that, why do you think that, to really deepen the conversation, and also for the teacher to help the students understand one another's ideas and to actually engage with one another's ideas. And after this discussion, students might re-answer the question.
Bill, we seem to have lost your sound. Are you still there?
I see that Bill is typing. So, yeah, I see that, Bill. We're not hearing you either. Yeah, you've dropped.
You can click on the button at the top to reconnect your phone. It should give you the options. Let's see. So if you're looking at the screen, you'll want to click on the handset button at the top of your screen. It should give you the options for rejoining.
I'm not sure that Bill can hear us.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that.
So hopefully that is self-explanatory.
It's dialing him out again, so he should be on momentarily.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Bill.
All right, I'm back.
Oh, good. Hi, Bill.
Hello.
Thanks
I'm not
so
sure what
much.
happened there.
Yeah.
I was hearing an echo and then dropped from the call altogether. But we'll keep going. I'll just pick up. So one of the things that's really important that we emphasize in the chapter on classroom assessment and the NRC book is the importance of having an interpretive framework for interpreting students' ideas. So that, for many people, is the framework of learning progressions, and there are learning progressions documents that are appendices to the next generation science standards. But the tool that we used is something called Facets that comes from Jem Minstrel of Facet Innovations. And it doesn't take a sort of the same developmental view about learning that learning progressions does, but we try to understand different pieces of student ideas. And we provide teachers with an interpretive framework for listening to what students say and for thinking about how you might push particular students given what they say in a classroom discussion. And this is one of the things I would underscore makes formative assessment in three-dimensional science and actually good formative assessment in any discipline very different from the very general strategies. I think one of the things that people tend to teach are general strategies like think, pair, share, or KWL strategies. But really those do not support learning unless we have an interpretive framework at the ready for interpreting what students are saying in light of what they might be thinking underneath, and then having a way to think about what it is we want to support them to do next. So the facets that we provide for responding to questions also provided us with a sense of, well, which ideas do we need to help students develop? And so we developed a set of activities that I'll mention in a moment to support that. So, and that's an example of, so one of the things that we did was have something called a contingent activity. And so that contingent activity provided a different way through the Investigating Earth Systems curriculum content than was provided in the hands-on investigation that they provided. And all of these investigations have the character that this one does, which is that it engages students in developing and using models as a science and engineering practice. And it's highly scaffolded. It also includes guidance for teachers about how they might interpret different student responses to the activities. So to kind of unpack this particular task before I share some of the tools that we've developed to help teachers develop NGSS three-dimensional tasks. This is an example of one that has multiple components that includes a clicker question, something that's actually a traditional multiple choice question, but it's designed specifically to elicit different facets of student thinking that we know are common among middle school students in earth science. There's a pedagogical pattern that engages teachers and students together in a discussion, an argument, if you will, about their ideas. And there's a contingent activity that engages them in the activity of modeling. And there's a cross-cutting concept linked with that contingent activity in that students are invited to reflect on the nature of systems and system models with each of those activity and what they have added to their understanding about systems and system models as a consequence of engaging in this particular model development effort. So it integrates those three dimensions in this way. So how do you go from these examples, which had pretty rich research resources to support them, to the reality that we face today is that we're working as school district folks and state level people to design for the first time three-dimensional tasks? Well, one thing that I think is really helpful is to begin with creating templates for task design. And this is good standard work. We call them test blueprints, often in assessment development. But in a sense, what these have as a character that's very different is to really focus on and help us attend to the three-dimensional nature of tasks. So traditionally, test blueprints tell you how many items of different types, like multiple choice or open-ended, you need on different content standards. And the ones I'm going to show you here focus on the practices. And I want to underscore here that these are task templates that you could build assessments for, but I think they're actually good instructional task design templates as well for helping students gain practice in engaging in science and engineering practices to develop an understanding of disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. And this can also facilitate consistency and understanding if you have a set of common templates. So one aspect of the template that we have is that we work first with people in our professional development activities with teachers to design tasks, with creating diagrams like a set of tables that have these three columns. First, as we go back to the framework for K-12 science education, and we do something called an unpacking. And you can read about this on materials on NSTA's website, and it follows the work of Joe Kraychuk and Brian Reiser in particular. But we try to break down the ideas that are in the DCIs, in particular, the disciplinary core ideas. And we go all the way back to the framework to focus on the grade level understanding. And we think about what are some components that might be bundled together into an assessment item. And in parallel, then we think, well, what is a scenario, a phenomenon, if you will, if you're familiar with that term, it's not that different, or the prompt that we can give. And I've given an example here that relate to the assessment, the first assessment task I showed you. We might present students with an illustration of so this is the sketch for that item you saw here, or it's a different item that has a similar disciplinary core idea. We then could ask students to create a storyboard of 3 to 4 drawings showing what would happen in the future in that zone, in a subduction zone, and they would label the plates and directions of movement to describe what's causing the changes. And I've got in the brackets, that's getting at both cause and effect as a cross-cutting concept and developing and using models as practice. And the other thing that's really important to imagine simultaneously is what is it that students are writing or saying or doing? And so here I've tried to write in mostly kid language a correct answer. And so I have to think about what that student work is so that I can check and ask myself, is that prompt really going to actually elicit that student work? Because a lot of times we think a prompt is going to be really good at eliciting a particular student response, and it's not. For all sorts of reasons, that prompt is more confusing to students. And by doing all of this in a row this way, we can actually then hand this off to a peer and say, does this make sense? Do you believe that students would write this in response to this prompt? Or maybe we really like the student work, but then we need to refine the prompt. Or there's a concern about the alignment to the DCI. By creating a little set of tables that are like this allows us to peer review and critique one another's assessment before we actually go and build the task. So this is something as we use as a pre-task to really understand what kinds of tasks do we need, what kinds of student work do we need to elicit in relation to what bundles or combination of components of disciplinary core ideas. The other thing we do then is, okay, I've got this, I want this item to be a developing and using model task. So one of the things that we've done is we follow a process called evidence-centered design in our research, and we've translated some of what we call design patterns in that work into a set of task types for various practices. We haven't built them all out, but we.
Oh dear. Bill, I don't know if you can tell, but it looks like you've dropped again, and so please. There you go. Are you here, Bill?
It's calling him.
Okay. John, do you think it would be working? Okay, great.
Good thing I'm almost to my end. So one of the things we've done is create 4 or 5 for each of the practices, a set of ways that you can write items. And we're now to the task template part of this. That's really the nuts and bolts of what we want to ask kids to do. You know, in one of our task types, you present students with an illustration or drawing of a scientific process, and then we'd ask them to label the components, the interaction and mechanisms in the model, and ask them to write a prediction about something that might happen that could be explained by the model. And I've made these available for you to view and download if you would like and would find useful on this tiny URL /NGSS task types so that you can see our work. I would emphasize that this is a work in progress and that we'll actually be sharing these at NSTA at a workshop that I'm doing with Phil Bell from the University of Washington if you'd like to join us in Nashville for that particular workshop. We'll be sharing a full list of all 8 and some example tasks for all grade levels. And so there's just a couple of more resources that I want to highlight that are available. The URLs for the Designing Assessments for the Next Generation Science Standards, that's the report that the committee wrote that I was on. And then Achieve has also developed a set of classroom sample tasks. Not all of these have been tested, I would emphasize. So use with caution. But I think they're a good set to begin to work with and adapt. And I have a set. For the last 2 years at NSTA, my colleagues at SRI and I did a day-long Professional Development Institute on NGSS and assessment. All of the slides and the materials from there are available freely at my website, learnddir.org, on the Talks and Papers tab. And then finally, and I've put some of these in the chat box, my colleague Phil Bell at the University of Washington has a wonderful website called STEM Teaching Tools, which is a great resource for getting people started talking about assessment in the NGSS. There are 3 resources related to assessment, including a summary of the NRC report and some work on classroom assessment there. So I would really recommend these. These are great tools that you can use in teacher professional development and also as you begin to plan together for state teams around NGSS assessment design. And here's just a little bit of an advertisement for our session at NSTA. We'll be talking about making science instruction relevant, and one of the things that we're going to do is highlight the way that you can, well, there needs to be an S at the end for that, task types for that one. So one of the things we're going to do is highlight one of the things that's really interesting development is how do we always talk about eliciting prior knowledge as part of assessment. How do we elicit students' interests in order to adjust our instruction so that we make it personally and community relevant instruction? So we'll be talking about some strategies there as well as sharing these assessment task types. And you can learn more in general about my collaborative work on formative assessment at the Research and Practice Collaboratory site, which is at researchandpractice.org. And I'll turn it over to Kathy now.
Thank you so much, Bill, and sorry for the drop, and thank you for being a trooper.
That's
Okay.
okay.
Thank you, Kathy. Take it away.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Bill. Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Comfort from West End, San Francisco. I direct a project called PASS, which is the Partnership for the Assessment of Standards-Based Science. And we have been working over the last 20 years with states and districts across the country and helping them with standards-based science assessment. And some of our current work involves working with the state on the development of a state summative assessment that's aligned to NGSS, and also working with an MSP project, statewide MSP project, in developing teacher assessments that are aligned to NGSS. And I do apologize for having a major frog in my throat today. I have pretty bad allergies. So what I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes is a brief overview of why we need to assess student learning, introduce a continuum of assessment within a comprehensive system, and mostly focus on classroom assessment. So as you know, assessment is the primary feedback mechanism in the educational system, and it provides information to students on how well they're performing, information to teachers on how well they're learning, and if they need to modify their instruction to help meet student learning. They also provide information to parents, districts, and policymakers. And as you know, there's no single assessment that can serve all of these needs. Okay, so Bill had mentioned earlier about the NRC report on assessment, and that this report is strongly recommending a system of assessment that starts at the classroom level, but it also builds up to the state level. So in looking at that continuum, a range of different assessment strategies are really necessary at the classroom, district, and state level to measure three-dimensional learning. And as Bill also mentioned, these new assessment systems will need to include a continuum of different components. And some states, like California, that have already adopted NGSS and are moving forward with their assessment system, are viewing assessments from the classroom to the state level as having 3 different cycles. So within those 3 cycles, they're looking at short cycle or formative assessment that are designed to inform day-to-day teaching. Then the next cycle is a medium cycle which is really focused on interim or benchmark assessments. And these are assessments that are done throughout the instructional sequence, and they ensure that students are provided adequate opportunities to learn science. And then they also have the long or the summative level assessments, and these are the end of course tests that districts usually administer, and also state summative assessments. And these are designed to monitor student learning on a much broader scale. Whoops. So this is a continuum that was adapted from a California Department of Education curriculum framework, and it represents just one way of looking at a continuum or a range of assessments from the classroom to the state level. And it starts with, oh, there's an error here. Okay. It's actually kind of interesting. Whoops. It starts with formative or diagnostic assessments, and these are the short cycle assessments. So these are the kinds of things the teacher is doing in the classroom every day. It's the minute-by-minute assessment, daily assessments, and some weekly assessments. And so these assessments are geared to look at a short period of teaching and learning. In the medium cycle, or the benchmarks and the interim assessments, this is where we're starting to look at what's happening with the unit or what's happening quarterly. And these are administered periodically throughout the year to measure a longer set of learning goals. And then at the end is the summative assessment, or the long cycle assessments. And these are administered annually, and you're looking at a much longer period of learning. And the thing that's kind of interesting about this model is that each level of assessment, or each cycle, provides different levels of information. And the NRC report on assessment, NGSS, is recommending an assessment system that starts here at the classroom level and builds up to the state level. And along the way, there's some kind of a moderation system that goes on. So states are actually monitoring some of the local level assessments, and that information from the local level is feeding into the state level. And I'll defer to Bill if I didn't quite say that correctly, if you're on the report. Okay, so within classroom assessments that support 3D learning, the short cycle or diagnostic assessments, they can focus on individual disciplinary core ideas, science and engineering practices, or cross-cutting concepts, or combinations of DCIs, SEPs, and cross-cutting concepts. But they're not intended to really focus on a multiple component assessment where you're looking at all three elements of a performance assessment. And so again, these short cycle assessments are designed to assess student prior understanding. So what do students know and what could they do? Let me write this arrow, sorry. And what could they do before instruction? So in doing this kind of, maybe it's an assessment probe or quick write or it's a KWL chart, it gives the opportunity for the teacher to find out, what are students actually bringing to the table, and how could this information help teachers plan appropriate and engaging instruction. The medium cycle, okay, I'm getting up on the arrow. The medium cycle is more of a continuous cycle of assessment, and these assessments also focus on individual disciplinary core ideas, practices, or cross-cutting concepts, or some combination of that, but they're not really focusing on getting at the true intent of performance expectations and at a multiple component test. That's really addressing all of those parts. So these are really ongoing assessments that provide continuous opportunities for teachers to assess, to listen to questions, provide feedback, and strategies could include whiteboards or exit cards or science notebooks and journals. And with these kinds of continuous assessment, the process of continually assessing is to seek and interpret evidence produced by learners and the teachers to decide where learners are in their learning, where they need to go, and what is the best way of getting there. And this was from the assessment research group in the early 200s. Paul Black and Dylan Williams were two of the researchers that did a lot of work on classroom assessment. Okay, then getting to the long cycle, this is focusing on measuring disciplinary core ideas, practices, cross-cutting concepts through interrelated tasks or assessments with multiple components. So this is where Bill was showing an example where you don't have a one-to-one correspondence between an assessment item and a performance expectation. In order to get at that integrated nature of performance expectations, you're looking at building an instrument that has items that maybe focus on a DCI or on a practice or on a cross-cutting concept, but when they come together, it's designed to measure what students have learned after the period, after a period of time, or as a summative test for a state test. Okay, this is a diagnostic formative assessment. It could be used as a short cycle test. It's a formative assessment probe that was developed by Paige Keeney and her colleagues in Maine. The probe is called Mountaintop Fossil, and I think it's kind of difficult to read, so I could quickly read through it, or do you think you could see it okay? Okay, I'll read it. It says the Esposito family went hiking on a small mountain. Mrs. Esposito picked up a shell fossil at the top of the mountain. The fossil was once a shell organism that lived in the ocean. The family had different ideas about how the fossil ended up there, and this is what they thought. Mrs. Esposito thought that a bird picked up the organism and dropped the shell as it flew over the mountain. Mr. Esposito thought water, ice, or wind eventually carried the fossil to the top of the mountain. Rosa said a mountain formed in an area that was once covered by ocean, and Sophia said the fossil flowed out of the volcano that rose up from the ocean floor. And so the question is, through the probe, what do you most agree with and why? Describe your ideas about how a fossil could end up on the top of a tall mountain. Now, the performance expectation is integrating the core idea, practice, and the cross-cutting concept. This question does not get at everything in that performance expectation. It does address some of the information in the evidence statement. So this is the evidence statement for that performance expectation. The evidence statement here at the top. Okay, the green arrow doesn't want to move. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the evidence statement here at the top, it's integrating the practice, the core idea, and the cross-cutting concept. And part of the evidence statement that that item is getting to is 1A, students identify the given explanation for a phenomenon, which includes a statement about the idea that landscapes change over time. So it is not getting at the full intent of a performance expectation. It's getting at a part of the evidence statement. In this next example, it's continuous formative assessment. It's a strategy taking from key strategies and example techniques for effective formative assessment by Dylan Williams, and it's designed around this performance expectation, MSES 1-1, and in the example, a middle school teacher is doing a lesson on Earth's place in the universe, and the teacher asks the class to draw a model of the Earth Sun Moon system in which they identify the relevant components on the whiteboard. So he has the class draw their model, and on the count of 3, the students all have to hold up the whiteboard at once, so the teacher could get a sense of what the students are understanding while the students engage in the task. The teacher looks around the class for all the models are correct. They move on with the lesson, but if none of them are correct, the teacher may stop to choose and reteach the concept in another way. So in this, so showing your model is not getting at the true intent of the performance expectation. Again, it's only getting at part of one of the evidence statements. So it's looking at, can students draw a model and in their model, can they include the earth, the sun, and the moon? So again, this is just getting that apart. In this last task, this is a summative assessment, and it was developed by Achieve, and it's on their website, and the website is at the bottom. Bill also has a website in his presentation, and it's intended to be administered over the course of a unit. It contains 10 interrelated assessment tasks or items, and these 10 get at the elements of performance expectations. So some of the items within this task address DCIs, other get at the practices, and other get at the cross-cutting concepts. But together, these 10 components measure the 3D learning as represented by the performance expectation. So these are the evidence statements. This is the performance expectation, and through the course of administrating this task, they're actually, the teacher and students are actually getting at the full intent of this performance expectation. Okay, so just in just looking through the research on the role of the teacher and the role of the student in classroom assessment, I think a lot of us understand that, you know, when teachers are using classroom assessment, they want to facilitate student growth and understanding through using the results to, you know, on the spot improve classroom practice, using to modify their instruction, for developing self-directed learners. And one thing that's really important is that they're also providing effective feedback in a timely manner on student-specific skills or knowledge. And according to William, this feedback is really important. In his research, he found out that when teachers provide a letter grade, it was nowhere near as effective as when teachers provided specific feedback, and students were able to use that feedback to improve their learning and improve their understanding of that particular skill or knowledge. One part that's not really discussed that often is the student role in classroom assessment. And research is saying that students should be partners in the classroom assessment process, that they should have an opportunity to help define the criteria by which they will be evaluated and learn how to apply these criteria in identifying strengths and weaknesses in their own work. And research is showing that self-assessment, peer assessment, and self-regulation are research-based strategies that do assess students in improving their own learning. And I just noticed that there are comments on the side, and I'm sorry that I haven't been looking at them. The evidence statements come from Achieve, and there are 3 sets of evidence statements. This one I'm showing right now is from the high school level, and then there are also the evidence statements from the middle school level and from the elementary level. And you can get them on the Achieve, on the Achieve website. And so just in summary, in looking at the characteristics of an NGSS-Aligned assessment, measuring 3D science learning requires assessments that examine students' performance of specific scientific and engineering practices in the context of cross-cutting concepts and disciplinary core ideas. These assessments need to contain multiple components, sets of interrelated questions to focus on individual practices, core ideas, and concepts. In some of the work that we're doing with state summative tests, we're developing what we call scenario events. And within those scenario events, we're playing out the performance expectations and using the evidence statement so that we can address the practices, DCIs, and cross-cutting concepts within that instrument. And together, that these components need to support inferences about students' 3-dimensional science learning, as described in the performance expectations. We are also using an evidence-centered design approach in developing the assessments so that we can look at what is the claims base, what is the knowledge we want students to have, and how we want them to know it, what is the evidence, and what will we accept as evidence, and what is the task, and how will this elicit the evidence that we're looking for in the students. And then also just in terms of classroom assessments, teachers, and they'll also mentioned in his presentation, need to use a variety of assessment activities that mirror the NGSS-Aligned instruction. And in summary, if you need to contact me, there is my email address.
Thank you, Kathy.
That's it. I hope that made sense.
Thank you. I think all of these examples have been really useful for thinking about how to move forward and where to find the resources to study for our own assessment task development. So at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions in the chat. I think some that came up during the presentation we answered, but what would you like to know? I see some people are typing. Multiple attendees are typing. Yes, well, we would. Here's one. Okay. So first of all, Heather, yes, the recording in PowerPoint will be shared, and since you're registered for this, you will get that notice. And also, if you were on the NGSS Discuss list that I mentioned before, you'll also get the notice through that. So Ed asks if Bill can address the issue of making inferences when questions have multiple dimensions.
Yeah,
so
thank you for that question.
Yeah.
Question, Ed. Yeah, so I want to give one answer, because some of you I know are designing for large-scale assessment, and some are for the classroom, even though this is focused on classroom. So I want to give one answer for the classroom and one for large-scale. It's in the classroom, it's one of the challenges with a big open-ended task that has kids engage in practices like constructing explanations and modeling, is if it's completely open-ended, you may not be able to diagnose adequately where a student may be having trouble. Is there some aspect of the disciplinary core idea or cross-cutting concept that they are having difficulty with, or maybe even in some dimension of the practice? So part of the scaffolds of multiple components you want to think about in designing tasks, where are the different places that students might get tripped up, and how can you help them launch into a really complex task? And that's really trial and error is how people in assessment design actually figure this out. It's not, in part, they're informed by their past experience, but one has to actually design and fail and design again to really figure that out. The second piece that's really important at the classroom level is this interpretive framework. I can't underscore enough. Part of the problem with, say, taking a really generic framework for how to improve formative assessment and applying it to the science context is what we really need to know is to help teachers actually interpret commonly held student ideas that are problematic and then give them very specific strategies for addressing those. And I think that is where formative assessment frequently falls apart. It's not in the elicitation of student ideas, but it's in interpretation and use. When we talk about large-scale assessment, one thing that I think is really important not to do is to separate out reports backed by the dimensions, because we know how accountability systems work. If we report out on a practice score, guess what's going to happen? All of a sudden, there's going to be teaching to the practices in isolation. If we report on a DCI score, the teaching is going to be to that dimension. And that's going to undo what the framework was trying to accomplish, which is to really to help us understand that proficiency is an integrated phenomenon itself. To know science is to be able to do it and apply a disciplinary core idea in a specific context to explain a phenomenon.
Great. That's a great answer. And then there's another important question here. How do you recommend using these sorts of assessment strategies for informal ed where there's shorter contact times, nature centers, science centers, museums, etc.?
I have an idea, but I'll let Kathy go first in case she has ideas.
Yeah, actually, we just received information from, I can't remember who it was, from someone on using these kinds of activities, but in a shorter context, I think that the providers in informal settings, I'm sure that, professional development is going to be needed for the providers in how to use activities that do get at, the different dimensions of the PEs, and then longer activities that would bring those dimensions, bring them together.
The other piece that I think of, which is really important in the informal science context, is really to be thinking about how we assess interest and the development of science-linked identities. And so I mentioned that we'll be talking, Phil Bell and I will be talking a little bit about that at NSTA and presenting some specific strategies. So there's other functions beyond the three dimensions of science of interest and identity, and really developing a sense of identity with engaging in scientific practice, and how those support addressing community needs, for example, in engineering. I think those are things that one might focus on productively in an informal science context.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bill and Kathy. There's a question about whether or not these resources include discussion of diverse learners, including sheltered English immersion or differentiated instruction.
Yeah, and our contingent pedagogies work, we expanded it to include a number of supports for English learners that has been developed in collaboration with folks from Clark County School District in Nevada, which include a set of sentence starters for students who are learning English. The other scholarship that I would point people to is the work of Corey Buxton at the University of Georgia, who he and his colleagues have developed a number of supports, including assessment supports for English learners and emerging bilinguals.
Good to know. Good to know. And then Kim asked a question about the potentials and pitfalls of computer-administered assessments. Thinking, for example, of students making use of large online data sets.
I'm going to throw that one to Kathy, because I know her colleague Edis is involved in that.
Right. There's a couple of different sides to this question. So I'm going to address one of the first sides in terms of publisher platforms and states moving towards large-scale assessments that are administered like the Common Core on a platform. And there is a lot of potential, because if you look at the kind of work that our colleagues at WestEd has done, Edis and Mark Loveland and Daniel Brenner, they've worked with some scientists, and it's a very successful, very rigorous online program, and it has a lot of capability, and students can do a lot with interactive simulations, and you can do scoring. It's a great system. But then when you start looking at how state tests are administered on publisher platforms, those platforms are very constrained. And so you're wanting to do these really rich and robust items where kids are doing things. They're able to, move objects. They can actually build the model. They could do some of the types of things that Joe Kraychak and Jim Pellegrino did in their online, online items for NGSS Assistant Science. But once you get to these publisher platforms, we're finding that we can do very simple drag and drop. We could do a drop-down menu. We can't do graphing. We can't do, have kids build models onto objects. So it's very limited, and I'm sure that there are going to be some platforms coming out in the future for large-scale and online that would, that would be much more amenable to the kinds of things that we're trying to do with NGSS.
Well, thank you so much. I think I learned a lot, and I'd like to draw everybody's attention again to the upcoming events in this series, and to hopefully get those on your calendar, and also to the email list if you would like to sign up there if you're not already. I'll put that in the chat. And with that, I'd like to thank our speakers.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you both for sticking with it and dealing with our connection and just pushing through everything that's going on in life. So thank you so much for being here, and I know we're all going to use these resources going forward.
And Susan, this is John. I'm
Thank you for inviting me.
gonna post a link to the evaluation form in the chat box, and I'll be sending it around on the email too. But if you could all take a minute and just give us some feedback about your experience with the webinar, it will help us make sure that the other webinars that are coming up will be as good as they possibly can be. So please do take a minute and fill that out.
John, there was a request to digest the resources that were shared in the chat too.
Yeah, I'll be saving those. We'll be able to post those on the website.
Okay, great.
Shelley, future webinars covering the same content. We have a number of things that could take lots of different webinars to cover. If you mean Next Generation Science Standards, Earth and Space Science, yes. We will be covering that topic broadly. And as far as more resources on more webinars on assessment or any of the other things that we've talked about, I think as people indicate interest and say and request more webinars on particular topics, then yeah, we can make it a series. We can make it an assessment series if that's what the community wants to see. So keep in touch.